Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Child, which is episode 1 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. So in this video, I review the episode The Child. So The Child is the episode where an alien entity comes on board and impregnates itself into Deanna Troi, who gives birth and comes out as her son Ian, who just wants to experience life. Meanwhile, the Enterprise is transporting a dangerous set of viruses that could be very dangerous and kill everyone on the ship if anything goes wrong. And something does go wrong, and the child Ian figures out that he is the one that is causing it to go wrong, so he decides to die, much to Counselor Troy's dismay, and then he leaves as the little energy being that he came, and then the Enterprise is okay. So, okay. First episode of season 2. So the big thing to talk about with this is that there was the writer's strike that apparently went on a lot longer than they had expected, which delayed season 2, and this would actually have effects for the show going all the way up to season 3, that they would be playing catch up. And mind you, this is, the days when they would have to do like 26 episodes per year, which is very different than modern television and streaming services. And so they were always having to play catch up. This problem was eventually solved in season 3 when Michael Piller came on board and decided to take scripts, accept scripts from fans or whatever, from anyone, which is a practice that a lot of people had an issue with, but I'll cover that more when I get to season 3. The point is that for pretty much all of season 2, they were playing catch up and having to, even at this stage, they were getting script ideas from any random person who happened to be at the lot. Apparently there was someone who was repairing computers, wrote the script for the episode Contagion later in the season. But what they did for this episode is they went back to a script that was already written. This script was written for the abandoned Star Trek Phase 2, which never happened because they did the motion picture instead. And as I said, there were a lot of elements from that idea that were also incorporated into Next Gen, which I talked about when I reviewed the pilot episode in kind of a far point. And one of those was that Troy was kind of based off of the character of Ilia. So the episode, the script for The Child was centered around Ilia, so they just changed that to Troy and changed the other things around to make it fit in TNG. And this is the major thing of note, because I didn't really know any of this about the writer's strike and all that. I think I knew that this was a Phase 2 script for quite some time, like decades ago I knew about this. But the whole thing with the writer's strike and how everything was delayed and that they were like rushing to do this episode, I didn't really know any of that until recently, and it makes total sense like when I input it, because I never liked this episode and it always seemed like really off to me, but now I'm like able to, with all this background information, more articulate why exactly it is. Now it like makes perfect sense that this is a incomplete script that needed more drafts, needed more passing, and it is a poorly written script, and that is the factoid of it. Now, in addition to this being a rush script that already exists for a different show, they decided to make changes between seasons 1 and 2, and this being the premiere episode of season 2, they had to address those changes, which were quite a bit, Rikers Beard, they didn't really need to address. You could just see that on screen, and I like how they didn't draw any attention to it. But the other changes they did need to address, such as introducing Whoopi Goldberg as Guinan, which is a huge thing, and a lot of people could get into that. How Roddenberry had an idea to have a very beautiful, very intelligent bartender who would help console people and talk to them. And they've apparently, LeVar Burton talked about it, who was friends with Whoopi Goldberg, how much he liked Star Trek and wanted to be on the show. Apparently they didn't take that seriously and thought, because the show had such a low budget, they thought that they wouldn't be able to afford her and that wouldn't work out. But he kept bugging her and bugging them about it, and eventually they talked to her about it. She said she was willing to do the show for whatever they could afford, and that she just wanted to be involved in Star Trek. And so things came together and she became Guinan, a recurring character for the rest of the series, which was actually quite a big boost, I remember, because Whoopi Goldberg in this stage in the late 80s was a huge celebrity. Even, I would argue, more so than she's considered now. She was really, a hot celebrity topic at the time. It's as if like Tom Cruise agreed to do, Star Trek, although maybe not that big, but still, like in that ballpark. So it was a huge deal bringing her on board, and I remember, because I didn't start watching Star Trek till several years later, but I even remember when this season first came out, hearing about, Whoopi Goldberg's on Star Trek, what? But anyway, so that was one. The other was the axing of Dr. Crusher. This had to do with Maurice Hurley, who became the showrunner in season 2, well, sort of more towards the end of season 1, going into season 2, and he hated, I don't know if hated is the right words, but he didn't get along with Gates McFadden. He didn't like her, thought she was too opinionated. He didn't like the character of Dr. Crusher, so he was very, very forcefully trying to get rid of her. And it's funny because there's a quote from one of Gene Roddenberry's assistants saying that Patrick Stewart didn't like working with her, but there's also a quote from someone, and in season 3 when they brought back Dr. Crusher, saying that Patrick Stewart was the one who campaigned to bring Gates McFadden back. So I tend to agree with the latter more than the former, that because they always seem to get along very well. But Maurice Hurley didn't like her, and he wanted to get rid of her very strongly. He went to Rick Berman, who said no, but then he went over his head to Gene Roddenberry, and Gene Roddenberry capitulated because he wanted, Hurley to more take over his own duties, so he wanted to appease him. And so they got rid of Dr. Crusher, and they brought in Dr. Palaski, and they brought in the actress Diane Mulder, who Gene Roddenberry had worked with as a guest star twice in the original series. And they said the idea was to make her sort of more gruff. I think it's obvious that they were modeling her after Dr. McCoy and trying to make another version of Dr. McCoy. And she was not received well by fans, mainly, and they described, because in the original series Dr. McCoy would have this antagonistic relationship with Spock, and even though I kind of hated it, some people really liked it and thought it worked, and because Spock was able to hold his own against McCoy, whereas with Data felt more like an innocent child. And so one person described the relationship between Pulaski and Data the way that she would really hound him more as like akin to child abuse rather than friendly banter. And so audiences were immediately put off by this, particularly in this episode where she calls him Data instead of Data and seems very dismissive of his feelings. But then later on she would really dismiss his right to exist as an android and really be very dismissive of him. And yeah, I think this is worse than having McCoy be a bit racist towards Vulcans. And I remember really not liking this myself when I first saw this. Now, I knew when I watched this, as I said, it was several years later when I watched this season, I knew her as the person from LA Law because I used to watch LA Law, and I remember she played like a really mean character that everyone hated who eventually fell down an elevator shaft. But she actually did LA Law after this, which I wasn't aware of, and so she was actually not that upset over leaving Next Gen because she thought it was, she described it as mutually agreeable, as something that worked for everybody because she thought she didn't really fit in, she didn't really like working in the cast that much, and wasn't well received by audiences, and she went on to do LA Law, which she much preferred. And it's funny because she talked about how her stars on LA Law would often be all snobby and to her for doing Star Trek and being like, oh, I can't believe you lowered yourself to do Star Trek. And she said that they would actually all be really jealous if they realized how much money she was making off of the residuals for just this one season, which I didn't think about it that way. But yeah, Star Trek Next Generation, even though it was seen as a less popular show than LA Law by far in a way when it was first airing, would make a lot more money in replay because it's become part of pop culture. So that is an interesting. But anyway, I digress. This episode had to introduce Dr. Palaski, had to introduce Guinan, and it also had to explain why Wesley Crusher would stay on the ship when his mother is gone. And so they had that as a plot line. So the point is, this episode already had two plot lines. It had the plot line of this energy being impregnating Troy and experiencing life as a child, and it had a plot line of this dangerous virus. On top of that, they had to... Oh, and I didn't even mention Geordi LaForge got a promotion. Worf and Geordi got promotions. Worf, they're both wearing yellow shirts now. Worf is the chief of security. Geordi's the chief engineer. Now, these things, they took care of very quickly, very subtly. Like with Worf, they didn't even mention it because I think he was already acting as chief security at the end of season 1. He just has a yellow shirt now. With Geordi, they just had a quick line of dialogue. Oh, this is our chief engineer. And Riker's like, oh, it's so good to see you as chief engineer. So that wasn't too much of a burden on this episode. But the Pulaski thing, the Guinan thing, the Wesley thing took up a fair amount of time. So they had these two plots of the alien child, the alien viruses, and then it had to introduce Pulaski, introduce Guinan, and explain why Wesley stayed on board. So you see what I'm getting at here. Overbloated. This episode was overbloated with way too many ideas. And also, combine that with the writer's strike and how they didn't really have time, and it was obvious this script needed way more passes. It was poorly written. Like, there's specific examples. I didn't write it down, so I can't remember exactly. But there were definitely specific examples of poorly written dialogue. Like, you could tell that this is the first or second draft of the script, and it needed more goes. And neither story, because this episode tried to do so many things, neither storyline really worked. I mean, the virus one was very simple and simplistic. You don't really need to flesh that out more. But the main storyline about the alien child, this felt really incomplete. This felt very half-assed, if I must say. I was not developed enough at all to justify its existence. And at the end of the episode, the alien child dies, and Deanna Troy cries, and they play sad music, and you're supposed to feel very upset, but it has literally no emotional impact whatsoever because this character was not developed at all. This story was not earned. This moment was not earned in the least because it was too rushed and there was way too many things going on. with this episode. Now, let me talk about there was this opening shot that was like a grandiose shot, which apparently the director's like, oh, the audience has been waiting forever. They deserve this cool shot. Audiences don't really care. General audiences don't care that much about cool shots. It's more about, the characters in the story. But, some people appreciate cool shots. But what I noticed most of all was the music. They went overboard with this music. If you haven't seen this episode recently, I would suggest going back and just watch the first 2 minutes or the first minute of the first scene, and you'll hear what I'm talking about with the music. They make it so grandiose. It's like dun 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 dun, dun! It's like you're supposed to get up and cheer, and it's like wow. I'm like, and what you see on screen is the Enterprise, a shuttle leaving the Enterprise, or coming into the Enterprise and docking with the Enterprise, and Data and people sitting on the bridge. So in other words, mundane, everyday, normal things is what you're seeing on screen, but what you're hearing is this da-da-da-da-da, this grandiose, heroic, these crescendos, and I'm like, I just want to go to the composer who composed this music for the scene and be like, calm down. It's just a shuttle coming in the ship. It is not that big of a deal. I guess they were mainly doing it for Rikers Beard, though, because it is the first time we see Rikers Beard. Look at his beard. Isn't it beautiful? But anyway, speaking of Rikers Beard, there is a common saying, and this is something I've heard Jonathan Frakes point out in an interview recently, and of course I was already aware of this even before he pointed it out. There's a common saying of growing the beard being the opposite of jumping the shark. So jumping the shark is a modern day idiom that came from Happy Days that refers to when a show does something really, really terrible and really goes downhill after that and becomes... For a good show, just jumps the shark, does something for attention to try to, get the viewers, but it's really obviously bad, and then the show just gets terrible from there. To varying degrees, but that's essentially it. And growing the beard is actually, a less popular idiom, but it's starting to become an idiom of a show that was not so good becoming great all of a sudden and finding its footing. So it's like the opposite of jumping the shark. And it comes from TNG, and it refers to Riker, how he grew his beard. Now, I actually take issue with that, or at least would say this idiom is not entirely accurate, because Riker grew his beard in season 2 and Next Generation did not become good until season 3. This is something that a producer, I can't remember who it was, but someone who worked on the show noted that season 2, actually they thought season 2 was worse than season 1, that the show only had 2 good episodes, Q-Who and Measure of the Man, and the rest of the season was crap, mainly due to the writer's strike and how rushed they were with writing the scripts. But regardless of whether you think this is better or worse than season 1, it's very clearly not when the show improved. The show did not improve until season 3. Season 3, incidentally my favorite season of the entire show, is the real good start of the season. So the idiom is not accurate because Riker didn't grow his beard in season 3. He grew it in season 2 when the show was still bad. So the idiom would have made more sense if it was something like bringing the Doctor back. Although that doesn't sound as cool as growing the beard, and it requires more of an explanation because they brought Dr. Crusher back in season 3. But bringing the Doctor back should be the correct idiom of when a show gets great, not growing the beard. But yes, it doesn't sound as cool, I will admit, but it's not accurate because he grew his beard in this episode and this season is still bad. Anyway, so this, as I mentioned, the side plot with the virus was passable. That actually didn't really need that more development because it was just a means to have a threat of the week or whatever. And I thought the guest star actor they had playing that doctor guy who was a bit of a gruff was kind of cool. So I actually didn't have much of an issue with that storyline. It was really cool seeing Geordi LaForge. This feels right, seeing Geordi LaForge as chief engineer throughout the entire. And I remember watching episodes of the first season and being like, I can't. Whenever I saw LaForge on screen, I would be like, I can't wait to get to season 2 because this is wrong. It's like every sensibility says this is wrong. Like to see, not only to see him wearing a red shirt, but also the fact that his character was very naive or was being like young and different and not the sort of tech geek that we know him as. And in this episode, it's not like they gradually changed. In this episode, instantly he's like the chief engineer. He is the LaForge he should be automatically in this episode. And I'm like, thank God. It was just so off-putting. And that's just because I'm used to the rest of the show and the majority of the show. And that first season, they really had a different idea of what this character was, and they definitely changed him drastically in season 2, and I think for the better. For sure, for the better. But then... So the Guinan, it was a fairly well introduction. I didn't really have any issue with that. I think she always worked well as a sort of a supporting character, and it really established what her deal is, that she's, good at talking to people and getting them to see things, and they had the side plot with Crusher. And they had to explain why he stayed on the Enterprise. I do think it was just a convenient way to keep this character on the show, because it actually doesn't make any sense why they would let him say he wants to stay on the ship. So what if you want to stay? You're not an enlisted officer. You were just there because your mother was there and she's not there anymore. But anyway. And why didn't he leave when she left? But whatever. That's all fine. As I said, the introduction of Palaski did not go well. This episode actually wasn't the worst. It actually gets worse a bit later on. Like they keep compounding her being an asshole to Data, which is not a good way to introduce a new character. And also, like, just her whole attitude is like, I really don't care for this character. And like most things in Trek, in modern days, there's like this hipster movement that always defends what people thought. Like people trying to say the motion picture is a good movie now, or that Wesley Crusher is a great character now. There's also the movement of people saying that Dr. Palaski is a great character and she gets undue hate. No, she doesn't. She doesn't get undue hate. Her hate is completely and totally deserved, and they absolutely needed to write this character off. But anyway, sure, I'll get into this more as I cover season 2. So let's finally get to the plot about the alien child. Now, I think I do need to address something somewhat controversial about this, that I've seen a lot of people describe this episode as saying that it was almost as if Deanna Troi was raped and had agreed to raise a rapist child. And I find that analogy inaccurate because I don't really see the alien being impregnating itself into Troi, although it was done, not with her consent. I don't see it as akin to rape because it was not a sexual assault. It was, I'm an alien who wants to experience life as a human. And so I want to go through the natural process. Now, granted, it would have been great if it got Troy's consent, but it was an alien that didn't really understand the human being. So, even though there is that element of not consenting to it, I think to describe it as a rape is inaccurate. I think that the analogy doesn't really hold. So that is something that doesn't really bother me. And also, as you can see, Deanna Troy, even though she knew it was this weird alien phenomenon, she instantly was attached to it as her own son and thought of him as her own son and loved this boy just as much as her, if it was her real son. And it was kind of, in a way, was her real son. And I like that. One of the scenes that I love the most about this episode is when they're in the ready room or in the conference lounge discussing this weird pregnancy because it's obviously a weird alien being, and Worf is like, kill it now, because of course he is. And everyone, all the men, Data, Riker, and Picard are all discussing, what should we do about this baby? What should we do with the pregnancy? And Troy's just sitting there listening to him, and eventually she just snaps up and was like, you guys can take whatever precaution you want, but just know I'm having this baby. And Picard looks around, everyone stops talking, Picard looks around and is like, well, okay, end of discussion. I love that. that is a great, and I think this really sets it apart from the original series. I couldn't imagine the original series doing something like that. But Picard is instantly like, all right, well, it doesn't matter what the hell we all think now. It's freaking her decision. She wants to have the child, she's having the child. End of story. And that was great. I actually do like that, and I think that actually, even though she decides to keep the child, that still has a strong pro-choice message, in my opinion. Because pro-choice isn't about, everyone must have abortions. Pro-choice is about the mother having the choice, which is the whole point. And I think that and they made that very clear, that this was her decision and no one else's. No men in executive business suits or positions of power should make decisions on pregnancy for other women. And so I do, even though the point is that she decided to keep the child, I think it's a very strong pro-choice message, which I appreciate. Anyway, but as I said, especially watching this episode just now, I didn't realize just how little we saw of Ian. He barely appears in this episode. We get no attachment to him, no development. He just plays with some puppies for a bit. He burns himself on purpose and then dies. I am sorry, but that is not an interesting story. And again, it's it's signs of a very poorly written script. And so overall, this episode just didn't turn out very well. So, now I would like to thank those who support me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It helps me thrive, helps the channel to continue to grow. So I want to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manigester, Joel Viles, Alessandro Michelcio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. Very much appreciated. So we do have a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "I'm not Indiana Troy," has a quote, and the source of the quote is Ian shortly after birth. Now, if you don't get that reference, it's a running gag Kyrie091 and I have, because I said one of my favorite lines from Move Along Home was Odo saying, "I'm not in Starfleet." But anyway, there we go. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, pursuing an episode during a writer's strike by rewriting a Phase 2 script and creating in a second year in a row for TNG, one of the worst season premiere episodes of all of Trek. The main story was underdeveloped and for the most part seemed to forget characterization for Troy. Worf gets one of his original kill it now comments in the series. He'll make this advice from time to time, such as in I, Borg, for example. Once Troy said she planned to have the baby. I did like how the conference room said, okay then, one small plus at least. But the story and its resolution was underdeveloped. We learned practically nothing about Ian, the alien entity. Meanwhile, Wesley's subplot was needed and did allow something for the introduction for Guinan to do, but otherwise, meh. It still made angry fans ask why Gates McFadden Crusher is no longer there. Meanwhile, the introduction of Palaski came across as so antagonistic to both Picard and especially Data, it made fans trying to accept the new Doctor on the ship almost non-existent, as she comes across as the Jellicoe of doctors, although turns out very competent in her role and open in the long run. But now, one rapey Tinkerbell reminiscent light out of 10. Although Lower Decks later at least made a noble effort to spoof this as the mind control one of these usual specks of lights in Trek. Yeah, I'm not sure if I remember the Lower Decks episode you're referencing, but my memory is a bit loose on those things, but yeah. Pretty much agree with everything there. So next comment is from Greg Marley, who says, so the second season begins with Riker in command of the bridge, showing off the beard, but no one commenting on it. Geordi is also pretty quickly introduced as the new chief engineer, and he presents some sciencey idea for the ship to show us his aptitude for the position of chief engineer was such a natural role for him that we often forget that for the first year, Geordi was pretty much just chilling in those original con chairs that made it look like he was in a lazy boy recliner, while the flagship of the Federation apparently was fine, having revolving doors for its chief engineers. We're also introduced to Palaski fairly quickly. I wonder if a lot of Palaski hate stems from the blatant coldness to Data and crude indifference to his personhood in the first appearance here, because as I recall, she warmed up to him fairly quickly, but we shall see as the rewatch continues. And I just realized that even though she was a full member of the crew for a whole year, she never got a send-off as far as I know. She's never mentioned ever again on the show or in canon after the second season. I don't think Pulaski warmed up to Data. From my memory, and again, I guess we will see on the rewatch, but from my memory, she continues to be antagonistic towards him. Maybe, like, by the end of the season, we get the peak performance, she warms up to him a little bit, but she's still being kind of, I don't know, warms up to him, but is still kind of a bit antagonistic, still kind of dismissive of his personhood. I don't know. But yeah, I do think that she deserved to be forgotten. But Norman Buckwald posted a response to this comment, pointing out that Pulaski was mentioned in one episode. I believe it was Who Watches the Watchers, when Crusher referred to as the Pulaski technique to erase someone's memory, and this refers to Pulaski erasing the memory of the girl in the episode Pen Pals, which we'll get to eventually. So she was mentioned at one time, and then Moriarty referred to being holding her captive, but didn't name her by name in sixth season Ship in the Bottle. So she was vaguely referenced, but I don't think she really needs to be referenced, really. And I think even Diana Mulder talked about how she was sort of forgotten about as soon as she left the show, which I do think it's something that the show should forget, because it never should have happened. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, "This episode is crap. I mean, it really is. First, Crusher is replaced by a character that I have to point out who's worse than Crusher, and she's rude, and I don't like how she disrespects Data. This would go on for the whole second season. I find the concept of this alien wanting to experience being a child kind of dumb. There's not much to it. The only thing that I always think about this episode is when that Riker gets his beard and Geordi becomes chief engineer, but besides that, this episode is dull, not memorable, so 3 out of 10. I actually do think it's an interesting concept that could be somewhat interesting of an alien wanting to experience life as a human. They just didn't do anything with it. It just showed up and left, basically. And like, I don't know, part of me also didn't really buy the attachment Troy had to his son because he was alive for like 3 days, I guess. I mean, I still imagine, given childbirth, that she would have some attachment to him, but I don't know. Anyway, my rating for the child out of 10 is going to be a 2. Extremely poor, so a bit lower than Ricky, but not as low as Norman Buckwald. Yeah, I do think that this was a very poorly written episode and a result of the writer's strike, and they just brushed off an old script that didn't really work in the context of TNG, and they tried to do too many things at once. Like, the subplot with Wesley and Guinan kind of worked, but it was just okay. I still think it was kind of silly how they kept Wesley on board, but of course they had to keep this character. They never should have gotten rid of Crusher, so that just created more problems. And yeah, the main storyline with the child did not work at all. Very poorly written. As I said, I did like some moments, particularly the moment where Picard stood up for Troy's right to choose. So that's why this episode doesn't get a 1 for me. But yeah, still really, really not a good episode at all. So that is it for my review of The Child. Just checking the schedule here, seeing what's coming up next. On my channel, Thursday will be my review for the latest episode of Lower Decks. Saturday, I'll be back with another TNG review for Where Silence Has Lease. And then Monday, back for yet another TNG review with Elementary Dear Data. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And also I cover many other Star Trek videos and many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.